In a world overflowing with noise, most leaders talk about what they do. Some explain how they do it. But the truly great ones? They start with why. Welcome to Thinknova, where ideas spark revolutions. Today, we dive into the groundbreaking vision of Simon Sinek, a journey that reveals how clarity of purpose isn't just a business advantage. It's the heartbeat of inspiration. Get ready to rethink everything you know about leadership, success, and what really moves people to act. Because this is Start With Why. The marketplace was crowded with ideas, products, and noise. Every company shouted louder than the next, hoping their voice would carry across the sea of competition. Advertisements came thick and fast, promises were inflated, and campaigns were crafted with precision. Yet, despite all the effort, many organizations struggled. Their messages didn't resonate. Their teams didn't inspire. Their customers didn't remain loyal. Beneath the surface of daily business operations, Simon Sinek had been watching. He had seen how some leaders seemed to inspire people naturally, how certain companies, despite facing setbacks, still found themselves surrounded by devoted followers. There was something different about them. It wasn't just what they did or how they did it. It was something deeper, something more meaningful. Simon began to dig, tracing the patterns of great leaders and organizations. He wasn't content with surface-level observation. He sought out root causes. As he explored, he found himself returning to the same examples repeatedly. Apple, Martin Luther King Jr., the Wright brothers. These names had something in common. They had something others didn't. It wasn't just brilliance. It was clarity. This clarity could be expressed with one simple question. Why? Why did they do what they did? Why did they believe what they believed? The more Simon examined the question, the more it revealed its power. Most people and organizations talked about what they did. Some talked about how they did it. But few ever articulated why. And that, he realized, made all the difference. This idea, the need to start with why, was more than a theory. It became a framework, a structure that explained everything from innovation to loyalty, from leadership to trust. At the core of his findings was what he called the golden circle, 3 concentric rings. At the outermost ring was the what, in the middle was the how, and at the center, the bullseye, was the why. Every organization and individual operated on all 3 levels. Everyone knew what they did, some knew how they did it, but only a rare few knew why they did it. Not to make money, money was always a result. The why was about purpose, cause, and belief. It was the reason they got out of bed in the morning, the reason they inspired others to follow. When companies and leaders communicated from the inside out, from why to how to what, they resonated more deeply. The golden circle wasn't just a model. It was a way of thinking, acting, and communicating that changed the outcome of everything it touched. Simon recalled the story of Apple. At first glance, they were just another computer company, but what set them apart wasn't their product, it was their purpose. Apple's why was to challenge the status quo, to think differently. This core belief shaped their how, their elegant design and user experience, and their what, the products they sold. By leading with why, they attracted customers who believed what they believed. That belief created loyalty, not just to the brand, but to the mission. This pattern wasn't unique to Apple. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't rally thousands by laying out a detailed plan for civil rights reform. He did it by communicating a dream, a vision rooted in belief. He started with why, and people followed because they saw themselves in that belief.
The Wright brothers, too, were underdogs in the race to flight. With limited funding, no formal education, and no government backing, they had every reason to fail. Yet they succeeded where others with more resources failed, because they had belief. A why that drove them through setbacks, failures, and ridicule. Simon saw that these stories weren't exceptions. They were proof. Proof that starting with why wasn't just inspirational, it was foundational. It explained how great leaders could inspire action, where others merely commanded it. Yet most businesses operated in the opposite direction. They started with what? They sold features. They emphasized benefits. They marketed products, not purpose. And as a result, their messages blended into the noise. Their leadership failed to ignite loyalty. Their cultures struggled to endure. The problem wasn't effort. It was clarity. Without a clear why, Companies lacked direction. Decisions became reactions to market shifts rather than expressions of identity. People came to work for paychecks rather than purpose. Customers bought for utility rather than belief. And in the long run, that fragility exposed itself in customer churn, in disengaged employees, in stagnating growth. Simon wasn't theorizing from afar. He had lived the consequences. In his earlier days, he had built a successful marketing career. But over time, the work lost meaning. The enthusiasm faded. He found himself waking up with less and less motivation. Eventually, he realized he had lost sight of his own why. That realization sparked his search. He didn't find the answer in textbooks or boardrooms. He found it in conversation, in research, in reflection. Piece by piece, he assembled a vision that would redefine leadership, business, and behavior. And at the center was the golden circle. It wasn't a gimmick. It wasn't a trick. It was rooted in biology. The human brain mirrored the golden circle. The neocortex, responsible for rational thought, corresponded with the what level. The limbic brain, responsible for feelings, trust, and behavior, aligned with the why and how. That meant people could understand what you said, but they could only truly connect with why you believed it. Facts and figures might sway decisions, but belief and emotion drove action. This is why gut decisions often felt more real than spreadsheets. Why people couldn't always explain why they were loyal to a brand or moved by a speech. Their limbic brain responded to something deeper, something that resonated beyond logic. So, when a company communicated its why, it spoke directly to that part of the brain. And when that why aligned with the beliefs of its audience, trust was born. Loyalty followed. Not because of what was sold, but because of what was shared. Simon understood that starting with why wasn't just a communication strategy, it was a leadership strategy. It determined how organizations built culture, how they made decisions, and how they navigated uncertainty. It gave leaders a compass. It gave teams a mission. It gave customers a reason to believe. And belief, once earned, created a bond that no competitor could easily sever. He observed that in organizations where the why was clear, people thrived. They stayed longer, contributed more, and took ownership of their work. These environments were less about micromanagement and more about inspiration. People didn't need to be pushed. They were pulled by purpose. In contrast, companies without a why leaned heavily on manipulation. Discounts, promotions, fear, peer pressure. These tactics worked in the short term, but they didn't create loyalty. They didn't foster trust. They became habits of survival, not tools of vision. Manipulations made transactions, but starting with why made relationships. The implications of this were profound. It meant that leaders had to do more than manage. They had to lead with belief. It meant that marketing had to do more than attract. It had to align. And it meant that every decision, from hiring to innovation, had to begin with clarity of purpose. As Simon shared this idea with others, it resonated. People began to see their own organizations in a new light. They recognized the absence of why in their strategy, their culture, their messaging, and they saw the consequences. But this awareness wasn't meant to criticize. It was an invitation to rethink, to realign, to rediscover purpose. Because the question wasn't just, what do you do? It was, why do you do it? And once that question was answered, everything else made sense. Apple didn't make computers. They challenged the status quo. Southwest Airlines didn't just offer cheap flights. They believed in democratizing air travel. The Wright brothers weren't chasing glory. They believed in human flight. And Simon Sinek wasn't writing another business book. He was offering a lens, a way to see the world not as a sequence of actions, but as a chain of beliefs leading to action. In a world overwhelmed with noise, the message was simple. Start with why. The power of why, once seen, could not be unseen. It was as if a fog had lifted for many organizations, revealing a path that had always been there but rarely followed. And with this clarity came responsibility. Knowing your why was not the end. It was the beginning. Because once you knew it, everything else had to align with it. Simon observed how difficult it was for companies to stay consistent with their why. The pressures of growth, competition, quarterly targets, these all made it easy to drift. Many started with a clear sense of purpose, only to lose it in pursuit of numbers. But those who stayed true to their why endured. They built legacies, not just businesses. One such example was Southwest Airlines. In the early days of air travel, flying was expensive and exclusive. But Southwest believed in something different. They believed that flying should be for everyone, that air travel should be accessible, democratic, and joyful. This belief became their why. Their how reflected that belief. They streamlined operations, focused on efficiency, avoided hub and spoke models, and kept their offerings simple. And their what, the flights they offered, were affordable and on time. But it was the why that connected with people, both customers and employees. Because it wasn't just about flying cheap, it was about making freedom of travel a reality.
Simon highlighted that when decisions were made through the lens of why, consistency followed. Southwest didn't offer in-flight meals or first-class upgrades, not because they couldn't, but because it didn't align with their purpose. Other airlines tried to copy Southwest's business model, offering low fares and quick turnarounds, but they failed, because they copied the what, not the why. And without belief, strategy fell flat. This pattern repeated across industries. When leaders acted in accordance with their why, their actions had authenticity. People felt it, they trusted it. But when actions strayed from belief, even well-intentioned decisions could erode trust. It was never just about the product, it was about the reason behind it. Simon then turned to the example of Martin Luther King Jr. He didn't give a speech titled, "I have a plan." He gave a speech titled, "I have a dream." That dream was rooted in a belief, a why, that all people are created equal. His power didn't come from policy details or data points, it came from conviction, from clarity of purpose. People followed him not just because they agreed with him, but because they believed what he believed. His why became their why. That is the essence of leadership. Not authority, not position, but the ability to inspire others through shared belief. Simon emphasized that true leadership required vulnerability. It meant declaring your why to the world and holding yourself accountable to it. That wasn't easy. It invited scrutiny. It demanded consistency. But it was the only path to lasting trust. He spoke of companies that once had clarity, only to lose it. Walmart, for example, began with a noble belief, Sam Walton's vision of helping people save money and live better. For decades, this belief shaped the company's culture, decisions, and identity. But after his passing, the company shifted. The why faded into the background, replaced by relentless focus on low prices at any cost. And with that shift came criticism, lawsuits, employee dissatisfaction, because the belief had been lost. And without it, trust eroded. Simon explained that customers are smart. They can sense when a company's words and actions don't align. They might not articulate it, but they feel it, and that feeling drives their behavior. People don't just buy what you do, they buy why you do it, and if they can't feel that why, they'll look elsewhere. In contrast, companies like Harley-Davidson maintained their why with fierce loyalty. Harley didn't just sell motorcycles, they sold freedom, rebellion, a sense of identity. And people didn't just ride their bikes, they tattooed the logo on their bodies. That kind of devotion wasn't the result of marketing tactics. It was the result of belief. Simon showed how belief wasn't a corporate strategy. It was a human need. People wanted to belong, to be part of something bigger than themselves. When a company shared a belief that aligned with their own, customers felt seen. Employees felt motivated. Partnerships became collaborations, not transactions. The Golden Circle gave leaders a tool to ensure that everything they did, every message, every product, every decision, flowed from a central, guiding belief. The goal wasn't perfection, it was alignment. When the why, how, and what were in harmony, authenticity emerged. And authenticity, more than anything else, inspired loyalty.
Simon challenged the conventional wisdom that leadership was about vision or charisma. While those things helped, they weren't the core. True leadership began with clarity, knowing your why, believing in it, living it, and inviting others to join you in that belief. He told the story of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Both were pioneers of the personal computer revolution, but their leadership paths diverged sharply. Bill Gates was driven by the desire to put a computer on every desk. His vision was practical, expansive, and deeply technical. He succeeded by building systems that allowed others to create. His why was rooted in empowerment through access. Steve Jobs, on the other hand, believed in challenging the status quo, infusing art and science, in creating products that were not just functional, but emotionally resonant. His why was about individuality, beauty, and simplicity. Apple's culture reflected that belief. Their design, their messaging, even their product launches, all aligned with that core. The contrast revealed something powerful. Both men were brilliant, but the legacy they left depended not on what they created, but on why they created it. Simon knew that uncovering your why wasn't easy. It required introspection, honesty. Sometimes it meant confronting uncomfortable truths, but it was worth it, because with that clarity came strength, and with strength came inspiration. He described the biological foundation of decision-making again, how the limbic brain, which governed emotion and behavior, responded to belief. This explained why we made decisions that felt right, even when they defied logic. It's why gut instincts were often more reliable than spreadsheets. The limbic brain didn't use language. It used feeling. And those feelings were stirred not by facts, but by belief. That's why storytelling mattered. Stories activated the limbic brain. Facts engaged the neocortex, but stories, rooted in why, moved people. The best leaders told stories, not just of what they achieved, but of what they believed. They shared moments, struggles, dreams, because stories carried emotion, and emotion carried meaning. Simon observed that organizations often misunderstood loyalty. They thought it came from satisfaction, from perks. But true loyalty came from alignment of values. When people believed what you believed, they became advocates, defenders, evangelists. They didn't just stay, they told others. Loyalty wasn't bought. It was earned through belief. He shared that customers, like employees, made decisions based on identity. They didn't just choose products, they chose symbols, statements, reflections of who they were or wanted to be. That's why a Mac user often had an iPhone, an iPad, and an Apple Watch. It wasn't just convenience, it was belief, identity. That identity began with the why. Simon laid out a simple truth. If you don't know why you do what you do, how will anyone else? The journey of Start With Why wasn't about creating better taglines or clever campaigns. It was about discovering your core, your cause, and then making sure that every action you took echoed that cause. Because when you started with why, you didn't chase customers, they found you. You didn't push products, you pulled people. You didn't demand loyalty, you inspired it. And in doing so, you didn't just build a company, you built a movement. As more and more people heard the message, Simon realized he had struck a chord that went far beyond business. The principles of why applied to any setting where people were involved. It wasn't just for entrepreneurs and CEOs. It was for teachers, parents, politicians, artists, anyone who wanted to inspire action, not just compliance. He began to see how the why connected individuals in powerful ways. When a person found their why, they found energy, they found direction. And when organizations helped their people discover that sense of purpose, they built cultures that thrived not on fear, but on passion. The link between inspiration and performance became unmistakable. When people were inspired, they gave more. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They didn't count hours. They didn't hold back. They acted like owners. because they believed in the mission. Simon looked at companies like Costco. The membership-based model was straightforward, but the culture was built on trust. Employees were paid well, treated with respect, and given stability. The result? Loyalty from both employees and customers. Costco didn't scream its values, it lived them, and that authenticity was noticed. Then there was Starbucks. More than just coffee, it sold a sense of community. Howard Schultz's vision wasn't just about profit, it was about connection. He believed in creating a third place between home and work, where people felt seen and valued. That belief trickled down into every cup, every store, every interaction. But Simon also acknowledged that belief alone wasn't enough. A clear why had to be backed by consistent how and what. If the products or behaviors contradicted the belief, the message collapsed. That's why integrity mattered. Not just personal integrity, but organizational integrity. Saying one thing and doing another destroyed trust faster than any failure ever could. He stressed that organizations must hire people who believed in their why. Skills could be taught, but belief was intrinsic. When people believed in the same purpose, they worked better together. They solved problems faster. They made decisions in alignment with the mission. And that cohesion created momentum. Simon explained that great companies didn't hire to fill positions. They hired to fulfill purpose. That shift in mindset, from filling jobs to finding believers, transformed the culture. Interviews stopped being interrogations about experience and started becoming conversations about belief. This was how JetBlue took flight. They believed flying could be human again. That belief shaped every aspect of the company, from customer service to in-flight jokes to uniforms. And even when things went wrong, customers forgave them more easily because they trusted the intent. Trust, Simon pointed out, wasn't a commodity. It was a relationship, built slowly, lost quickly. And at its core was consistency between why, how, and what. He observed how some companies thrived in hard times, while others collapsed. During economic downturns, organizations driven by purpose often outlasted those driven only by profit. Because purpose created resilience. It gave people something to hold on to when everything else seemed uncertain. He shared stories of teams that stayed late without being asked, who volunteered for hard assignments, who gave their best not because of incentives, but because they believed in what they were doing. That was the power of why. It turned employees into partners, customers into advocates, vendors into collaborators. Simon noticed that startups by nature often began with a strong why. The founders had a vision, a problem they cared about solving, a cause they believed in. But as they scaled, that why could fade unless deliberately protected. Growth brought process. Process brought bureaucracy. And soon, the purpose that started it all became a paragraph in an onboarding packet. Unless leaders made it a daily practice to revisit the why, it risked getting buried beneath performance metrics and efficiency charts. He encouraged leaders to repeat their why often, not because people forget, but because they need to feel it. Stories, rituals, symbols, all were tools to reinforce belief. Companies like Disney excelled at this. Their mission to make people happy wasn't just a statement, it was a way of life. From janitors to animators, everyone understood the magic they were creating. Simon revealed that when companies lost their why, even their success became hollow. He recounted conversations with executives at companies that were growing in revenue but shrinking in meaning. They had money, market share, and recognition, but not fulfillment. Because success without purpose felt empty. On the other hand, smaller organizations with strong why-based cultures often punched above their weight. They didn't have massive budgets or marketing departments, but they had belief. And belief is contagious. He talked about the law of diffusion of innovation. This principle explained how new ideas spread. At the front of the curve were innovators, followed by early adopters, then the early majority, late majority, and finally, laggards. The tipping point happened when early adopters influenced the early majority. But here's what mattered. Innovators and early adopters didn't just buy products. They bought belief. They were willing to take risks because they resonated with the why. And once they were on board, their influence helped sway others. That's why companies needed to start with why. Because the people who made movements happen, the passionate ones, only moved when they believed. Apple didn't just win because of its design. It won because early adopters believed in thinking different. That belief spread, not because of marketing dollars, but because of alignment. Simon emphasized that mass market strategies often skipped this step. They tried to sell to everyone, and in doing so, inspired no one. But those who focused on belief built tribes. Tribes of people who didn't just buy, they belonged. The secret wasn't in appealing to all. It was in connecting with a few who believed deeply. Those few became evangelists, and evangelists built movements. The mechanics of influence changed when belief was at the center. Traditional advertising pushed messages outward, but belief pulled people inward. It created emotional resonance. It bypassed logic and went straight to the heart. This was how trust scaled, not by persuading, but by aligning. Simon also pointed out the dangers of false starts. Companies that saw the success of belief-driven brands often tried to mimic them. They changed their taglines, made emotional commercials, and declared values they didn't live. But customers saw through it, because authenticity couldn't be faked. He recounted stories of organizations that said all the right things, but behaved differently behind closed doors. The result was always the same: cynicism, disengagement, and decline. That's why the why had to be real, not aspirational, not invented in a conference room. It had to come from experience, conviction, and consistency. Simon urged leaders to discover their why by looking backward, at their personal stories, their pain points, their inspirations. Because often, our why is rooted in our childhood, our struggles, our deepest values. For companies, the why often lay in the founder's origin story, what problem they wanted to solve, what injustice they wanted to fix, what dream they were chasing. And if the founders were no longer there, it became the leader's job to rediscover it, to breathe life back into it, to make it visible again. Because when the why faded, the how became routine, and the what became forgettable. But when the why burned bright, everything else came alive. Simon shared how even military units relied on why. The Marines trained for more than strategy. They trained for belief. They instilled purpose into every action, and that purpose made them unstoppable. He saw how charities that communicated their why raised more money than those that focused only on needs. People gave not just to solve a problem, but because they resonated with a cause. He described how school systems could be transformed by teachers who taught with belief. Students remembered passion more than content. They followed inspiration more than instruction. In every field, the lesson was the same. Start with why, and everything changed. The momentum of why wasn't just a philosophy. It became a movement. Simon began to share his findings across industries, stages, and cultures. No matter the audience, executives, students, military leaders, or artists, the message resonated. People didn't need another strategy. They needed a reason. They didn't need louder messages. They needed clearer purpose. And that purpose was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't a new concept. History had always celebrated leaders who inspired with belief. People who gave speeches that shook nations. Founders who built institutions that stood for generations. Every great movement, every lasting idea, every revolutionary shift, it all began with why. But in the speed of modern business, in the race for quarterly profits and market domination, many had lost that clarity. They'd mistaken tactics for vision. They'd confused what they did with why they began. And Simon had come to remind them. He spoke about trust, not as a soft value, but as a hard advantage. In the marketplace where every company offered products that were fast, cheap, or better, trust was the true differentiator. And trust was earned by consistency. When a company's why, how, and what aligned again and again, people began to believe. And belief turned customers into fans, employees into believers, vendors into allies. Simon noticed how clarity of why gave leaders courage. When a leader knew their purpose, they could say no with confidence. They could resist trends that didn't align. They could focus. Because clarity was a filter. Without it, decisions were reactive. With it, decisions were intentional. He illustrated this through stories of companies that had chosen purpose over profit in the short term and found long-term reward. Patagonia, for instance, built a business rooted in environmental responsibility. They made clothes, yes, but their why was about preserving the planet. That why showed up in everything they did, from the materials they used to the campaigns they ran. And when they told customers to buy less, they gained more. Because people trusted their intent. Simon repeated that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And when they believe what you believe, they'll walk past 10 other options to choose you. Not for convenience, not for price, but for meaning. That meaning is what fueled innovation. When a team was aligned on why, they weren't just solving problems, they were creating change. They challenged each other, not to impress, but to advance the mission. Why gave risk a purpose, and it gave work a soul. Simon explained that every organization had a split: leaders who made decisions and people who executed them. When the why wasn't clear at the top, confusion spread downward. And when people didn't know the purpose of their role, they defaulted to compliance. They did just enough. They followed instructions. They avoided blame. But when the why was clear, people took ownership. They saw the bigger picture. They became part of something larger than themselves. And when that happened, performance soared. He stressed that clarity, discipline, and consistency were the three pillars that supported the golden circle. Clarity of why, discipline of how, consistency of what. All three were needed, but it started with clarity. Without a clear why, even the best discipline and consistency led nowhere meaningful. Simon shared how sometimes leaders asked him if their why could change, and his answer was simple: it shouldn't. Products might evolve, strategies might shift, but the core purpose should remain the same, because the why was the root, and only healthy roots could grow strong trees. He pointed to the example of the Wright brothers again. They didn't succeed because of funding or connections. They succeeded because of belief. They inspired those around them. Their team worked with passion, not for fame or fortune, but for flight. Contrast that with Samuel Pierpont Langley, a man with more money, more backing, and more attention. He failed because his why was to become rich and famous, not to change the world. And people felt the difference. That's why belief mattered. Simon explained that the most powerful movements didn't begin in boardrooms. They began in hearts. When leaders spoke from belief, they lit a fire, and others carried that flame forward. He recalled how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. never forced people to march. He inspired them to march, not because of orders, but because of belief. He didn't say, "I have a plan." He said, "I have a dream." And dreams speak to the soul. That same energy could be found in the corporate world. When leaders stood for something meaningful, teams rallied. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. But Simon warned that starting with why was only the beginning. Living with why required vigilance. It required checking every action against purpose. It meant saying no more often than yes. It meant hiring slowly. It meant staying small in spirit, even as the company grew in size. It meant having the courage to walk away from opportunities that didn't align, because success could be a trap. The more a company grew, the easier it was to compromise, to pursue numbers over meaning, to chase trends over truth. But compromise diluted trust, and diluted trust destroyed belief. That's why the most successful companies, the ones with tribes, not just customers, were the ones who protected their why with devotion. Simon saw that in companies like Zappos. Their why was about delivering happiness, not just shoes, not just service, but joy. And everything they did, from customer calls to internal policies, reflected that. Their call centers had no time limits. Their employees were empowered to solve problems creatively, because the goal wasn't speed, it was connection. That connection came from belief. He emphasized that belief scaled, slowly, yes, but deeply. Belief created movements that outlived their founders. It passed from generation to generation. It built cathedrals, launched revolutions, and shaped cultures. And in a business world obsessed with what? Features, benefits, campaigns, Simon reminded everyone to return to why. Because that was the foundation. It wasn't about abandoning strategy or execution. It was about aligning them with purpose. When the why drove the how, and the how shaped the what, everything made sense. Decisions had clarity. Teams had cohesion. Customers had loyalty. Simon also spoke about the responsibility of leadership. Not just to deliver results, but to protect the why. To be guardians of belief. To keep the flame alive. Because once the why died, everything else became hollow. He encouraged leaders to ask the hard questions. Why did we start? Why do we exist? Why should anyone care? And then to share those answers boldly. To hire people who believed. To build cultures that lived the why. To make the why visible in every product, service, and message. Because when you start with why, you lead with belief. You inspire trust. You attract the right people. And you build something that matters. In the end, Simon wasn't selling a formula. He was inviting a shift. From manipulation to inspiration. From transaction to transformation. From profit to purpose. And in that shift, he saw hope. Hope for better leaders, stronger organizations, and a more inspired world. Because if we all start with why, we'll end with something far greater than success. We'll end with significance. You've just uncovered the force that drives every truly great leader, every loyal team, and every lasting movement. The power of why. Now, it's your turn. Dig deep, define your purpose, and lead from the inside out. Because when you start with why, the world doesn't just follow, you inspire it. This is Thinknova, where thoughts ignite transformation. Stay curious, stay purposeful, and remember, your why is your legacy.